All right. Hi, I'm Angela. I am the president of DiDD and the webmaster at Ron Cabarrus Community College. I'm so glad you all could make it today. Sorry about some of the technical difficulties. We will iron those out as we go and do more of these, hopefully. But I wanted to introduce you guys to Keith Stiles. He is at Blue Ridge Community College, and he's going to be presenting today on responsive design. So go ahead and take it away. Also, please, if you're logged in, mute your microphone so that we don't have any feedback issues.
Okay, thank you, Angela. I'm going to screen share with you all, so give me just a second to start that. Responsive web design is relatively new. It's been around for a couple of years, but it's only really recently started taking off. And one author that I've read on the concept of responsive web design called it the building sites for an anywhere, everywhere web. And I think that's really the concept we're talking about. Most of us are used to working with a mobile device and a tablet of some type, and the problem with that is our websites don't always fit well on those devices because they're not designed to fit well. Back around the year 2000, in really what is the first written work on the concept, John Alsop, writing for A List Apart, in an article called The Tao of Web Design, said that designing adaptable pages is designing accessible pages. And that was really the first time that anyone had tried to address the issue of adaptable pages. We're used to our fixed width pages. Alsop said that underpinning all of this is the belief that designers are controllers. Think about the implications of the term pixel mechanic. And I know that all of us have, at any point in our career, gotten down into the pixel level and controlled what the user is seeing, because we do like to have that control. But what is responsive web design? Well, it's a term that's only been around for a couple of years. It was first coined in an article written by Ethan Marcotte for A List Apart. And so his quote, I think, that sums up what he's talking about, was that rather than tailoring disconnected designs to each of an ever-increasing number of web devices, we can treat them as facets of the same experience. We can design for an optimal viewing experience, but embed standards-based technologies into our designs to make them not only more flexible, but more adaptive to the media that renders them. In short, we need to practice responsive web design. And that was when the whole concept was termed. And in that article, he actually built the first responsive web design and illustrated how it could and would work. The problem with trying to design to devices, obviously, is the number of devices, and then those screen sizes of the devices is so varied and multitudinous, and even our desktop screens are of so many different varieties that you just can't find a perfect pixel size that will meet every design need. We've done everything we can to put ourselves in control. But the fact remains that we were never in control. On the web, users are in the driver's seat. And even though we don't like to admit that, users can zoom in, zoom out, they can change the size of the browser, so they have more control than we do. A few things we need to think about is the fact that by the end of 2011, there were 5.9 billion mobile subscriptions worldwide, which represents 87% of the world's population. And the global shipment of smartphones surpassed PCs for the first time ever in the fourth quarter of 2010. So it's only a trend that is going to grow as time goes on. And we also have multiple types of devices now. We have smartphones, we have tablets, we have internet-enabled TVs, we have e-book readers, and all of those have browsing capabilities, but they're all different. So if you're still not convinced that we really need to do this, think about the fact that if you look at your Google Analytics or whatever analytics system you use, there isn't a standard display size anymore. in the early days of the web, in the early days of computers, there was a standard display size. But when I look at our Google Analytics, I think we have 300 different entries just for the sizes of desktop screens, and then you mix into that the variety of mobile screens at both portrait and landscape, and you've got a real mess. So one of the results of that was organizations began responding by creating separate sites for different devices. So we would have an iPad version and an iPhone version and an Android version. That, of course, is not workable in a world where we have devices that just keep getting more and more devices. Now we have, in addition to iPad, we have the Kindle Fire to deal with. We also have various versions of Android-based tablet systems. So, and we have the Microsoft Surface system. So we don't really have a way to do this scalably, and really need to be able to produce one site and then multiply it using our CSS and our HTML. So if you're still not convinced, think zombie apocalypse. Since zombies seem to be all the rage right now, Scott Jensen argued that we have a commoditization of smartphone hardware. And along with that, you have plunging prices of integrated systems on chip devices, free Linux clones like Android, and so you have cheap cloud-based devices, and they just keep multiplying. So he called this cheap device wave a zombie apocalypse of cheap electronics, and it really necessarily is forcing a change in how we approach user experience design. So what is Marcotte's responsive web design approach? And it really is Marcotte's. Everyone who is doing this is basing it off his original concept. It really is basically three elements. You have media queries in your CSS file. You have fluid grids that are controlling the layout of the page, and you have scalable images. The scalable images we'll come back to in a little bit is one of the trouble spots. So a responsive site does not equal a mobile site, and that's something that people automatically say, well, it's a mobile site. It's not really a mobile site, it's a responsive site. It's responsive to and can be part of a mobile strategy. But in doing that, you have to think about designing for mobile first, which is another concept that's been really popular lately, is the fact that you design for your mobile device first and then progressively enhance to cover the larger devices. So, quoting Marcotte again, he says, when I'm speaking or writing about responsive design, I try to underline something with great big Sharpie-esque strokes. Responsive design is not about designing for mobile, but it's not about designing for the desktop either. It's about adopting a more flexible, device-agnostic approach to designing for the web. So what do we mean by device agnostic? Well, we really mean anything, component, layout, etc., that is designed to be compatible across different device types and operating systems. So we really are looking at an enhanced form of what is known as progressive enhancement. Instead of doing graceful degradation, where you build the bells and whistles website first and then degrade that experience for users who either refuse to upgrade to something other than Internet Explorer 6 or just don't have the capabilities because of their technology that they're using, we would in the past gracefully degrade from that baseline experience using our CSS, but the concept of a device agnostic approach turns that on its head and says, let's progressively enhance. Let's start with the base being what we would allow someone on a mobile device to see, and then progressively move and give them more interactivity. In his book, Adaptive Web Design, Crafting Rich Experiences with Progressive Enhancement, he describes it as kind of like a peanut M&M. The content of your page is the peanut. The presentation of that page is the chocolate. That's the CSS. and then the interactivity of that page, which is often driven by some JavaScript, is the shell. So content is always the core, but then you layer functionality on top of it, and that's how you get the progressive enhancement. So what are our options with layout? Well, of course, we have 4 basic options, and those haven't changed over the years. Most of us are used to doing fixed width design, where the site width is constrained, maybe by 960 pixels, or whatever we've chosen as our max width. Fluid layouts, on the other hand, are where we determine the layout by percentages and not pixel measurements, allowing that layout to resize based on the available screen real estate. Elastic layouts are just similar to fluid layouts, but the constraints are determined by the type size, and we usually make that constraint in an M measurement, which is common with fonts. And then, of course, we could do a hybrid layout, where we combine 2 or more of the preceding layouts into a hybrid format. Generally, responsive design will focus on using media queries with a strong elastic or fluid layout, and that uses the fewest breakpoints to create less CSS to write. One thing we should do with layout in responsive design is avoid using pixel-sized fonts, because we all know that in pre-IE9, pixel-sized fonts don't scale, and so you have an accessibility issue if you do use pixel sizing. You can do the same thing by either using M units or percentage units anyway. Another thing we have to think about in this modern age is, because even though we are losing some control with responsive web design, we still want things to look nice on the screen. We still want to have a certain degree of control over how things are laid out on the screen. And so another big trend with this is to couple your responsive design with a grid layout. Grid layouts, of course, have been around in the print world for years. They're really gaining major traction in the web world now. They're nothing but order, creativity, and harmony to the presentation of information. We're, as humans, attuned to find information in certain areas of a page. We all know that if you look at a heat map of a web page, left top is going to be the brightest region of the page, and so often, where does the logo go? Up on the left and the top of the screen. So we're basically just codifying some of our layout with a grid. It does make it easier to add new content consistently with your overall presentational view if you use a grid. And it does facilitate collaboration. Typically, you divide the canvas size or the browser window into 3, 5, 9, 12, or even 16 columns, and then work from there, letting the content fit within the grid of the page. More appropriate to design media queries is to go mobile up. Start with your smallest screen size and then scale up with your media queries. You add the media queries in your style sheet. You have to remember that anything pre-IE9 doesn't support a media query. So you'll need to have a style sheet that you'll either need to use some browser technology in the form of JavaScript to enable IE at least 7 and 8 to see the media queries, or you'll just have to give the users on IE 6, 7, and 8 a different experience, because you just can't do everything in those 3 versions of the browser that you can in the modern browsers. So what does a media query look like? Well, what you do is you first, in your CSS, you set the base styles for the page. Those should not be in a media query. Those styles are basic no matter whether you're on a mobile device, a tablet, or a full screen. And then you set your media queries and modify elements to fit on that smaller canvas. And so it's just simply called with an @media all, and then you set a min width. And the CSS and the browser are basically looking and saying what's the width of your viewport, and then loads the appropriate CSS rules based on that viewport. So you have to determine breakpoints to determine where things are going to resize. One person I read suggested that you start at 300 pixel browser viewport and then size up slowly until it becomes clear the design needs a new media query. So you don't necessarily design specifically to the device. In fact, many people working with responsive web design are trying to get people to avoid designing specifically to the iPad screen resolution and size and the iPhone, because we're just back at trying to control based on device. Media queries do have some quirks with navigation. You can create a responsive navigation structure by using a combination of CSS and JavaScript. What that does is set a toggle that will, depending upon which viewport you're in, turn the navigation from a horizontal across the top of your page navigation menu to a drop-down menu. That's especially important for mobile devices. And then there's a great post there at Brad Frostweb about techniques you can use to do responsive navigation. Again, remember, Internet Explorer versions prior to 9 don't support media queries, so none of this will work. You can use conditional comments, however, to load style sets for Internet Explorer 6, 7, and 8, and each one of them has their own quirks. That means your earlier versions of IE would not get a responsive design, but they would still be based on a fluid layout. With anything, there's always a fly in the ointment, and responsive media is the big fly in the ointment. There's no easy method for making images responsive yet in HTML5 or with CSS3. One approach that has been taken is to selectively serve images to mobile devices by removing them entirely from the HTML, designing for the mobile experience first and then progressively enhancing. I'm not sure that I totally agree with that, because I think you don't necessarily want your mobile experience to be all text, but you do need to take into effect the fact that they don't need to download 100, 200K image every time they hit this page, because that's significant bandwidth for a mobile phone. There are options for dealing with responsive images. I've given you two there. One is Sencha.io source, and another one is Adaptive Images. They both rely on some JavaScript to basically give you the option of selecting from a group of images. So you would essentially have to have an image for each of your breakpoint sizes. Of course, we have an additional wrinkle now because Apple has the Retina display. And so the resolutions on that are about roughly double what they are on a regular screen. So we have to add to our media queries if we want to take that into effect, because images do look pixelated on a Retina screen if they're at regular resolution. And so we have to, with WebKit browsers, we just add a WebKit min device pixel ratio to the media query. And then we can actually deal with the image. One thing we can do to get around the responsive image thing is just set our image to be 100% in our style sheet. And so when you do that, the image is contained within the container and will resize with the container. It's not the perfect approach, because obviously you still have a larger file size on that image, but it does work. And then you can also basically double the pixel size of the served image and get a perfect view for a Retina display. Responsive video is another issue, and I added this one because I was actually listening to a webinar yesterday through O'Reilly, and Jonathan Stark was talking about, well, we really don't have a way to do responsive video because you have the aspect ratio to take into consideration. And so he pointed out that there was a JavaScript that has been built to deal with that allows us to have a responsive video. And it resizes the video within the aspect ratio. Another area to think about responsively is your content. And we know that content strategy is a growing sub-discipline within web design, and part of that is about making our content future ready. Responsive content adjusts to the context of our page size and needs. So what we're saying is a mobile user doesn't necessarily need the exact same layout and may not even need entirely the same content. And I quote, technology will change, standards will evolve, but the need for understanding our content, its purpose, meaning, structure, relationships, and value will remain. And we have to think about what content is appropriate depending on what device we may be thinking about, what screen size. Most people who are now moving into responsive design are choosing purposefully to use HTML5 and CSS3. HTML5 because it's semantically rich. It has benefits for other technologies like screen readers and enhancing the readability of those pages. I like it because of the semantics. I can use less of a div structure and more of a semantically rich structure that somebody could actually read and understand what I'm doing. CSS3 has the advantage of giving us a lot of stylistic detail that in the past we had to use images to do. We had to use background images to do much of what we did in the past, even with box shadows and text shadows. Now that's natively part of the CSS specification. So one of the things people worry about when going this route is, well, how much of this can I use because my browser may not support it? Well, there are two tools you can use to evaluate the browser support of HTML5, CSS3, scalable vector graphics, and a few other web technologies. The best is caniuse.com. It literally will tell you exactly which version of all the major browsers supports what specification, what elements of each of the specifications. Another thing you can do is run the HTML5 test, which will analyze the browser you're in currently and tell you how well it supports HTML5. Not surprisingly, Internet Explorer versions 8 and below and early versions of mobile browsers have the lowest support for HTML5. So 6, 7, and 8 of IE are notorious offenders for the lack of support of these advancements, but Firefox, Chrome, Opera, and Safari have all been showing pretty much widespread standard support. Just a quick look at what you can do with HTML5 as far as layout. Well, you can replace that old div ID equals header with a header tag, or you can replace your div that's defining your navigation with a nav tag, or the aside in an article, you can add an aside. You can have multiple sections in a page. You can have multiple articles within a section. You can have multiple headers and footers on a page. So it's really kind of the sky's the limit, and you can really get some control. Let's go back to that concept of progressive enhancement and non-compliant browsers. So I was talking a little bit earlier. Graceful degradation basically is designing a page for the most advanced, the most capable browsers, and then you make fixes. So you journey from complexity to simplicity. So you create the most beautiful complex page you can to work on your preferred modern browser, and then you degrade that experience while keeping it viewable and pleasurable for the viewer into less enhanced browsers. Progressive enhancement, on the other hand, focuses on the content, and its concept is you start with a foundation. This is our solid foundation of what we absolutely think the user needs, which is, as some designers are saying, should be a mobile-first strategy. And then we add enhancements to it for each of these progressively more powerful situations. So progressive enhancement is the layered approach. Your first layer is clean semantic HTML. That means you're allowing text-based, speech-based, antiquated and robotic user agents to navigate the content of your website. The second layer is your CSS, and now more than ever it's important to divorce your design from, or your structure, your semantic structure, from your actual presentational layer, and that's where your CSS comes in to give the visual representation of your content. And then the third layer is JavaScript, where you enhance usability. Some helpful tools for progressive enhancement: Modernizer. It's a JavaScript library. It detects HTML5 and CSS3 features in the user's browser, so that you can determine, basically it can determine what style sheet it should be using. Or Selectivizer is a JavaScript utility that emulates CSS3 pseudo classes and attribute selectors in Internet Explorer 6, 7, and 8. The pseudo classes and the attribute selectors are the biggest missing features within CSS3 that IE 6, 7, and 8 cannot handle, and so Selectivizer will basically give those browsers the ability to recognize that. There are also any number of frameworks that you can use to get started with a responsive design. Those include the HTML5 boilerplate. 52 Framework has one. There's the Twitter Bootstrap, and there's literally probably 25, 30 good ones out there that you can use. So important elements of a responsive design: use M-based specifications, and we'll talk about, if you're not sure about M's, we'll talk about that in a second. Make sure you put your base styles outside of your media queries for specific screen specifications. If you choose not to go with one of the options to force responsive images, set your image tag to 100% to cause the image to resize to its container. Design for mobile first. Try to avoid setting breakpoints based on device sizes like the iPhone, the iPad, or the desktop, but focus on the line length instead. We know there's kind of a standard line length that is suggested as easier to read on the web. If you design around that line length, you can change padding and line height and a whole other list of things to keep that line length and deal with your breakpoints that way. Keep any presentational aspects out of your design in your HTML and keep them in the CSS. HTML is only for structure. So what's an M? Most of you will probably know, but a lot of us are still used to using pixels. So an M is just a percentage size of a pixel. Essentially, most body text size on browsers is set at 16 pixels because if you sit back away from a monitor, 16 pixels is about reading size in a standard book. And so then you size everything around that base 16 pixels. So 1 M equals 16 pixels. So if you want to use 10 pixels for something, you just take 10 divided by 16 and you have 0.625 M's as a size. You can use it on everything. I created a design for a different version of this presentation where I even did the padding in M's. Jonathan Stark in the session yesterday mentioned that he still uses pixels for his padding, but uses M's for everything else. So let's take a look at some responsive design. By the way, the picture there is a picture of Ethan Marcotte's responsive web design book from A Book Apart. If you're really interested in going with this technology, that's the first book you need to read. It covers all the basics, all the important details, and will get you up to speed quick, and it's short. All of the A Book Apart books are great. I'm going to go over to my browser and show you some sites that are responsive. This is one from Jonathan Stark, and what I would encourage you to do is, I'm not going to do it on this screen, but I would encourage you to do it on your own, is to go to this page and resize it, because you'll notice some really interesting things that are going on, and I'm going to show you the CSS for this particular site. But for instance, this image is huge, but it resizes perfectly to fit a mobile device. These icons with each of his columnar sections, the icons disappear as you go into a smaller and smaller device setting. And all of that's being taken care of in the media queries. The footer menu navigation goes from horizontal to vertical at the bottom in the totally phone-based design. So that's one that is really good to look at, and the CSS for that is contained in this file. His default CSS, of course, is all the basic styles that are controlling that page, and what you'll notice about that is he's using, for things like his unordered list anchor elements, he's using border radius 0.5 ems. So notice you're not seeing pixels for anything like line heights. He's using CSS3 with the RGBA and the alpha set.
Hey, Keith.
Yeah.
I don't think we're seeing what you're seeing. We're still on the slide.
Oh, you're still on a
Sorry.
slide. Oh, bother, web developer, and just look at the CSS, because he uses nothing but ems in that. He has broken his media queries out into a separate style sheet, and so he uses that separate style sheet to cover those, but all the base styles are outside of the media queries. Another site you can visit that is a responsive design site is the Boston Globe. Boston Globe has been responsive for quite a while now. New York Times went to a responsive design last year. And if you want to see a multitude of examples of pages that have been designed responsively, go to media queries/RWD. And I think there were, I saw for sure 20 or 30 pages of websites, and they've got images of the mobile version, the tablet version, and the full desktop screen version of the site right there, so that you can see that it reorients depending upon the device. Some resources you should be aware of. If you're interested in this, Ethan Marcotte is step number one. Read his work. You can take it and basically replicate it and start your own design. That's what we're doing here at Blue Ridge. We're basically in the process of a website redesign, and we debated, okay, should we do a mobile site and a desktop site? And having worked with enough of this now for a couple of years, I know that it's hard to get people to refresh their content in just one version of the website. So I consciously chose to emphasize responsive to at least alleviate that issue. Another good book is Implementing Responsive Design, Building Sites for an Anywhere, Everywhere Web. That's from New Writers Publishers. It's a really good book. It's detailed. It really gets you thinking about things beyond just the min width. That's not the only thing you can do with a media query. You can set min height among a host of other things. Another great one that's kind of, if you really want to have a book that you can just work through kind of as a tutorial, Responsive Web Design with HTML5 and CSS3 by Ben Frayne. That's a Packet book, and those who are Moodle schools, if you work with your distance learning, Packet does most of the books for Moodle. SmashingMagazine.com is just chock full of articles on responsive web design and everything that we've discussed today. They have two books, the Smashing Book 3 and 3 1/3, which are geared towards redesign, and specifically they get into a lot of the responsive web design elements. Then, of course, A List Apart, which is where Ethan Marcotte coined the term, and also where the Tao of web design was first written. And then this link I've given you here is just a sampling of 15 responsive CSS frameworks, and most of them are reputable. I've seen them at least in a number of different articles mentioned, and so that is definitely, if you don't want to start from scratch, you can certainly use a responsive CSS framework, and it gets you up to speed quick, and then you can build from that. So I guess at this point what I'd like to do is take questions and comments, if you have any. I don't know how many people we have with us that can ask questions.
If you aren't logged in with us, you're in a couple of second delay, but if you want to post your comment on the event page, we'll make sure that Keith gets them.
Right. I'll be glad to take emails. In fact, my email is jk_stiles, S-T-I-L-E-S, at blueridge.edu. I'd be glad to take emails. You can look me up on blueridge.edu and call. We're learning this ourselves. We're really in the early stages of a redesign, and I'm pretty excited to be taking this approach. I think it's got definite advantages. Of course, with any new approach, it's got definite downside because we're learning from scratch. But I think it's definitely something that we all need to be aware of, because I really think it is going to become the standard.
We have one question. Jessica would like to know if you will share your slides with everybody.
Of course. Be glad to. I did a longer version of this at CDUG in November, and so I'll share both sets of slides because I adapted some of those into this presentation, but the other one covers all of HTML5 and CSS3 as well. It was a 3-hour session. So, any other questions?